All right, so now we are up to lecture number 3 in Rudolf Steiner's commentary of the Gospel of Matthew. And in this lecture, Steiner sets out to answer, again, we're still right at the beginning of the text here, where the Matthew author has inserted a genealogy of 3 times 14 generations, leading from Abraham, the progenitor of the Hebrew race, the Hebrews as a race, down to, or as a people, let's say, down to the Christ. And it's given in 3 separate paragraphs. If you look at the text, it's actually 3 separate paragraphs. One that begins with Abraham and goes down to David, which we saw last time was the movement from moving from Moses to stopping at David/Mercury. And then it goes from, in the second paragraph, from David to the Babylonian captivity, which we saw was the reason for Steiner's the Babylonian captivity is the Venus, the equivalent to the Venus period. And then from the Babylonian captivity down to the life of Christ is the third period here. And so what Steiner wants to do then is give his esoteric explanation for why we have 3 times 14 generations. He takes a long roundabout way to get here, but as always with Steiner, there's always a payoff. So, and he starts off by recapitulating his cosmogony, the one that we are now very familiar with. It can never hurt to go back over it again briefly, that he gives in Outline of Esoteric Science, where we have the 4 distinct phases of the evolution of the solar system from the old Saturn period, the old Sun period, the old Moon period, and then finally to the Earth phase, where we get for the first time the actual formation of physical planets and the physical Earth. But during, he says here, during the old Sun, or the old Saturn period, which is called Saturn, remember, because it's as wide around as the orbit of today's Saturn, the only thing that was there really was warmth, just warmth. No air, no gases, no solids, nothing during this period. This is an astral evolution of the solar system. We don't get the Laplace theory of the genesis of the solar system until the 4th phase here. So this is only a period of warmth and human beings coming into being as these little warmth eggs during this period, which extinguishes in a prolaya. In the next period, we get a recapitulation of the warmth. And now in addition to the warmth, we get a densification into air or gas, a certain gaseousness, which then lights up an astral sun. So we have air, warmth, and light during this period, which is why Steiner calls it Old Sun. But it's about as wide around as the orbit of Jupiter, so it could also be referred to as Old Jupiter. Then it extinguishes, there's a prolaya, then it moves to Old Moon, and during this period we get the further densification now to liquids. So now we get liquids, and then the separation of the sun from the earth, and then eventually the moon has to be expelled from the earth because there are certain processes within the earth that are calcifying and hardening, and bodies are having a hard time as they reincarnate coming back, and they're finding them very stiff and calcified. So the earth has to be ejected. And of course, in our contemporary solar system mythology, we know that the Earth wasn't ejected. It was another planet slammed into it to eject the rubble that was condensified into the moon, or it might have been 2 moons that have sutured together. Either way, though, in Steiner's mythology, the moon has to be ejected so that it can receive the sun's spiritual forces more directly and allow it to get rid of the calcifying, the hardening, the mineralization processes, that so it ejects the moon out toward the sun, as it were. And then there's another prolaya, an extinction. Then finally we get phase number 4, which is the Earth phase, where things solidify now. So now we get solids. There's a recapitulation of the previous phases of warmth. We get the hot Earth, let's say, and of air, and the formation of an atmosphere of carbon dioxide, and then the oceans begin to form from asteroids or comets, meteorites crashing into the earth and bringing ice crystals with them that then melt, form an ocean. And then finally we get the Earth phase and the movement then into the Atlantean period. But before that, he wants to point out this interesting idea that he has about these ethers. He says that there are 3 ethers that form during this process. And I haven't heard him mention this detail before. He doesn't mention it in Outline of Esoteric Science, where we sort of have these 7 basic substances. Then we have the warmth, which is fire, of course, and then air, and then liquids and solids. But we also have the formation of a sound ether, he says, which is not physical sound. It cannot be heard with the ears, but it's a kind of cosmic tone, that has been referred to in the tradition as the music of the spheres or the harmony of the spheres. And it moves through and interweaves through evolution the same way Steiner says that Chladni forms when you draw a bow, a violin bow, across a plate of sand, and we see the famous beautiful geometrical figures that form. It's kind of like that. It's like these sort of invisible Chladni figures that work on the human astral body. And there's also, in addition to a sound ether, there's a light ether and a life ether. The light ether is the only one that's visible to outward perception. The life ether is not. But the life ether works like the sound ether does toward the process of morphogenesis and bringing things into being and form. Form comes out of these ethers. And then he says, so when we sleep, when we go to sleep, the astral body and the ego separate from the physical body with the etheric body. The etheric body has to be there, otherwise you have death. So those remain behind. And then in sleep, what happens on the astral plane is that the astral body plus the ego sort of expands and goes outward into the solar system as a whole, where then these ethers work on it, the sound ether and the life ether. But he says especially the sound ether works on it to organize and refresh it from the damage that has been done to it through the senses during the daytime, and so that it's worked upon, and then when it goes back into the physical body and the etheric body, it requires the etheric body for thinking to be able to think, and the physical body for outward sense perceptible knowledge. And so this is sort of the prologue he gives to this lecture to sort of recapitulate his whole mythology, put everything into perspective. And then he talks about how these processes were available to the Atlanteans through clairvoyance. They still had clairvoyant vision where they could look out into the world and see and experience these forces directly. They could experience the sound ether. They could still hear it and experience it through their perception, the sound ether and the life ether. But even during the Atlantean phase, there are three phases of the Atlantean civilization. There's a gradual loss of this clairvoyant ability. And so to compensate for it, they have to invent the oracles. And there are the 7 oracles that they invent, which are these initiation schools. Let's say this is the basis for what later becomes the mystery schools in the traditions, where an initiate is put aside and his outer senses are isolated for a period of 3 days so that then he can experience these ethers, the sound ether, the music of the spheres, and the life ether through clairvoyant perception. So that these schools had to evolve as a sort of a way of making, to compensate for this gradual loss of humanity's clairvoyant vision. So then Zarathustra is, of course, one of the inheritors of this mystery school tradition. We've gone through the Indian epoch, the first post-Atlantean epoch, and then the second is founded by Zarathustra himself, the Persian epoch, who then, as we saw last time, has 2 pupils that he bequeaths, as it were, his astral body and his etheric body to. The astral body, which contains his sun wisdom, goes to Tot, the god Tot, the Egyptian god Tot, but Steiner says that he's later incarnated as an actual person who brings into being the third post-Atlantean epoch, the Egypto-Chaldean epoch. He's the founder of this. And then Moses, of course, then inherits the etheric body, which confers upon him the earth wisdom and a historical evolutionary understanding of the processes in the earth. So Zarathustra then has bequeathed these 2 subtle bodies to these 2 pupils of his, but now he wants to donate his physical body. So there needs to be perfected for him a physical body within which he can reincarnate in a perfected physical body. We saw that he had an incarnation as a Babylonian priest during the Babylonian captivity. So he has already reincarnated, but for the final, ultimate reincarnation, which will be, of course, the body of Christ, this is what he needs to perfect the third of his. All 3 bodies have to be reincarnated in a state of perfection. And then so Steiner talks about how, with regard to his developmental model, that actually becomes the model for the Waldorf schools and how children are taught through phases of 7 years. Steiner has this idea that from birth to the first 7 years, and a threshold is signified by the child's loss of the teeth at around age 6, 7, 8, the teeth fall out. This is the period in which the child's physical body is worked out, and the etheric body is latent the child doesn't have access to it yet because so much of the energies and formative forces of the etheric body are being used to build the physical body, which is the most rapid period of the development of the physical body in one's entire lifetime. So the etheric body is really taxed, and there's not much left over for the development of any sort of much cognitive ability on the part of the child, other than what's necessary for basic survival. So then at the age of 7, and this is marked by the loss of the teeth and the new set of teeth that comes in, there's a shift in the subtle energies, and the etheric body is now freed up and is available for the child's use for the next 7 years. This is why Steiner says children should ideally not be taught to learn how to read until about this time, about the age of 6, 7, right in there. That may be a bit drastic, I think, but nonetheless, there's a basis for it because the child can think more clearly now at 7 than at any time previously. So the etheric forces are now available to be not just for the physical body, but now for the development of the intellect. So the etheric body is developed over that 7-year period. Then at 13, 14, 15, right in there, we get the astral body that's now freed up and sort of unleashed through the dramatic transformation, once again, of the physical body to puberty with the unleashing of the sex drive, the change of the voice in the male, which is very significant. That all happens with the onset of the astral body being sort of awakened and unleashed. You get all these changes with hormones and the sex drive and the menstrual cycle for women. Lots of changes happen once again. So for Steiner, this is never, for a materialist, this is all just explainable by chemistry. But that's only the efficient and material causes. The formal and final causes of Aristotle are not involved, and they have to be taken into account because these dramatic transformations do not just happen as the result of billiard balls knocking each other around, chemicals knocking into each other. It doesn't work that way. There are subtle bodies involved in structuring these formative processes. So I think that Steiner's on very, very firm ground here, perhaps the firmest ground in all of his ideas regarding these subtle bodies. They are real. They are actual. And also his ideas about reincarnation and karma. Whatever the other elaborations of the weirdnesses of his mythologies, much of which probably is not true. But nonetheless, myth is a tool that is also used to fill in gaps in knowledge where certain things are not known. You fill in the gaps with myth, and that keeps the system up and running and makes possible these other truths that can shine through the external lattice work of the myths, let's say. So the significance of this now is that with regard to the Hebrews as a people developing the physical body of Christ, it's not an accident that it takes 3 times 14 generations to do this, because Steiner says that something similar goes on for the development of a people. Every 7 generations something happens, but it's really 14 because during the generations, traits that are inherited and passed along usually skip a generation. As is well known, many an intellectual has a father that is none too bright, as I can attest in my own experience, but a grandfather who is. So we know that these traits, even Mendel had already figured this out, that traits skip generations. So it takes 14 generations for this. So now he starts talking about Abraham a bit. And he says, so Abraham then is the progenitor, the father of the Hebrews as a people. He begins actually in a Sumerian city, the city of Ur, U-R. And Ur is not just some, a lot of times you read the Bible and there's just references to these random places and cities that sound like that must be inhabited by barbarians. This is not the case with Ur. Ur was a cosmopolitan city. It was one of the central cities of the Sumerians, although at the time of Abraham, which is reputedly about 1700 BC, although a lot of scholars think he's a purely legendary figure. In contrast to Moses, everyone agrees Moses was historical. You can't get around that. But with Abraham, maybe, maybe not. I suspect that he is historical, otherwise we wouldn't have him. The Hebrews had an intensely historical mentality. And so roughly about 1700 BC, and that's the time of roughly of Hammurabi's Babylon, which is 1790 BC, where the Babylonians have conquered the Sumerians, like the sort of progenitor of the Romans vis-a-vis the Greeks, and they have politically conquered the Sumerians, but they are conquered in turn by Sumerian culture, which overlays them, and they pick up Akkadian, It's hard to believe that the Babylonians just came in as barbarian nomads, because they became acculturated very quickly to the Sumerian world, and we get the best myths and stories ever produced by the Sumerians written by Babylonian scribes. Whoever the genius was who invented the Gilgamesh epic dates right from this period here. The standard Babylonian, or rather the old Babylonian version of the epic, dates from 1750 BC. Hammurabi is somewhere, scholars dispute again, somewhere between 1790 and 1750. And this is supposedly the time of Abraham, who up and leaves the city of Ur one day. And Ur was sacred to the moon god. Or each one of the Sumerian cities had at least one temple, sometimes more, but at least one temple for a central patron deity of that city, for which the mythology of each city was that it was invented specifically to serve the needs of that one god. That's why we have cities. That's why we build them. Not for economic reasons. We do this to serve the gods. That's the myth that brought cities into being. And so they're serving the moon god Nanas-Sin, and Ur is the sister city of Uruk, from whence the historical Gilgamesh came, and is a solar city. It's sacred to Venus, the planet Venus, via Inanna, and also her father An, who is the god of the pole star, An. So An and Inanna, but it's also has the solar dynasty from which Gilgamesh is said to be descended directly from the sun. So we have twin cities. One is a solar city, one is a lunar city. In any event, Abraham leaves, and then Steiner quotes a Talmudic legend about Abraham to the effect that it was thought that Abraham's father was a captain who was in the service to a Babylonian king named Nimrod, and that it had been prophesied, and this is a standard myth, it had been prophesied that the captain's child would overthrow him. And so the captain then demanded that he bring his child, and so the captain substituted somebody else's child, brought it in, and then secreted Abraham, or at this point he's named only Abram away into a cave where he spends his first few years living inside of a cave, and it says that he nourished himself with the ability to suckle his own fingers and to suck milk somehow out of his fingers. And in a way, Steiner says this is interesting because this sort of self-fertilization is analogous to the turning inward of what we talked about last time, where the Atlanteans could use their clairvoyant vision to perceive outward into cosmic space, and then with the Hebrews it turns inward, which is what we have here with a little Abram in the cave nourishing himself. But also I thought about this finger motif, and Steiner says that there was also a legend to the effect that Abraham invented arithmetic. Not literally, of course, Steiner points out, but the legend points to the fact that with Abraham, we have for the first time the approach of the intellect now. Cognition, not other clairvoyance faculties of the psyche, to approach the divine. Whereas before, in previous traditions, humans, in order to have knowledge of the divine, to commune with the gods, had to do so through clairvoyance. Abraham is the first to use cognition, actual thinking, to be able to do this. And so, but it's interesting, I thought about the finger motif there in connection with arithmetic, because it reminded me of the fact that the Egyptian god Tot, whom Steiner said is the progenitor of the third of his post-Atlantean epochs, the Egypto-Chaldean, Tot was a god of writing, and two animals are sacred to him, namely the ibis. Normally you see Tot with the ibis head, with the crescent moon-shaped beak, but also with the baboon. And the reason the Egyptians associated him with the baboon is because it was thought by the Egyptians that baboons counted on their fingers, because apparently they have a habit of doing this thing with their fingers, whatever that is. I've not observed it, just read about it, but whatever they did with their fingers, it looks like they're counting, and Tot is a god of writing and the mind and so forth, so they associated the baboon with Tot. Just a little footnote there. So anyhow, so Steiner says, so we have with Abraham then the founders of the Hebrews as a people, and the hereditary, so we have the sort of physical organ of the brain now, which has to be passed along through heredity. And this is why it's so important that in the ethnic traditions of the Hebrews that these hereditary traits are passed along through the blood. So then Steiner says, so likewise, because the traits skip generations, we're really dealing with a cycle of 14 generations in which from Abraham then to David, as Matthew gives this, the physical body, as it were, of the Hebrews is worked out, or rather, sorry, I've got that back, should be the etheric body, because we're working up toward Christ as the physical. So the etheric body is worked out first. Then in the second paragraph, where we move from David down to the Babylonian captivity, we have the sort of working out of the astral body. It takes 14 instead of 7, but it's directly analogous to Steiner's 7-year cycle. And then finally, from the Babylonian captivity to Christ, where Christ as a physical body now is the perfect vessel. And this, of course, as we're going to see, there are two Jesus children, which is a little awkward. I still find this hard to get used to, that and the Solomon Jesus, the one that's descended in this line, in the Matthew Gospel, goes from David through Solomon to create the physical body, so that Zarathustra can reincarnate then in a purified physical body, as he reincarnates his ego now into the physical body of the Solomon child, Christ. In the Luke Gospel, we get the Nathan child, where Luke traces the genealogy going through Solomon's brother Nathan. So it traces through that line. And so Steiner will actually say there are two Jesus children. And the Zarathustra ego, when the Solomon child dies, will transmigrate into the ego at the age of 12 of the Nathan boy, which is why we find him teaching all of a sudden in the temple. Whereas before that, he had been thought to be rather slow. But all of a sudden, his parents are out shopping in the bazaar one day, and they find him in the temple, and he's teaching. And it's like, how did this happen all of a sudden? Steiner says, well, it's because the Zarathustra ego transmigrated into the ego of the other Jesus child. Bizarre. You'll never get anything but originality from Steiner. That's why I like him. It's just one astonishing idea after the next. But that brings us up to speed then for this lecture.